If you are struggling with the beginning of your novel, and maybe you just don't know what to write, or maybe you feel like you've got lost, I think it's natural to assume that you're struggling with structure. And yeah, that might be the case. The first 5 points we're going to talk about in this video are structural tips for how to help the middle of your novel. But I also think there's a possibility that you might be having some sort of character problem. And so the last 4 points of this video are going to talk about character issues and talk about how if you really know your character and know how to make them change, it's going to help you revive the middle of your novel and make it flourish. Let's start with point number 1. Prop it up with a tent pole. Now, most writers keep all their climactic material for the end of the novel, where, the climax naturally appears. But a tent pole is a climactic event that happens right in the middle of your novel. Think of it as kind of a proto-climax. Now, the advantage of having a tent pole right in the middle of your novel is it divides the middle of your novel into 2 sections, which I think makes it a little bit more manageable. And having a tent pole is very satisfying for the reader because they get this big surprise or twist or story movement forward, and that entices them to read all the way to the end because they're now anticipating like the absolute big climax. A tentpole is also a sort of point of no return for your character, so the character knows, and also the reader knows, like there's no going back after this point. They're committed to the story in a more significant way. Now, an example of this might be Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. And spoiler alert, if you don't know the book or the movie, but in the middle of this book, we suddenly get a POV shift and we start getting it from Amy Dunn's point of view, and we realize Amy is not only alive, Nick hasn't killed her, but also she has very carefully plotted a way to frame her husband for her murder. It's just this huge, jaw-dropping moment in the book, and it's not at the very end, it happens in the middle. So if you can, erect that tentpole right in the middle of your book, it'll give you something to write towards and then to write off on for the second section of that middle. Now, if you're struggling with the middle of your novel, the second step is to juice the story. A lot of writers make the mistake of the stakes that they have in the beginning of the novel are the same stakes that they have all the way to the end of the book. That's a problem. What you want to have in your book is stakes at the beginning of your novel and then escalate by the middle of the novel to make things even more dire and even more important. Let's look at the film Orange County, which is actually where I'm from in California. In the beginning of the movie, the big question is, will he or won't he be able to get into college, specifically Stanford? Now, the stakes in that case are he's worried about, wasting his life. So it's very much this existential stakes of, will my life matter? I want to make it matter, so I want to get into college. However, the middle of the story radically escalates those stakes. He goes to Stanford and ends up lighting the admissions building on fire accidentally. So now what are the stakes? Oh, now the stakes are, is he going to go to jail for arson? Those are significantly higher stakes. There's also a raising of the personal stakes because his girlfriend Ashley says, oh, if you go to college, like you're going to have to break up for me. So now we're not just dealing with an existential crisis, we're dealing with, oh, I'm gonna have to break up with my girlfriend. But raising the stakes is only one way to juice your story here in the middle. A second way would be to have some sort of reversal in the middle. So reversals can take many different forms. It might be that the character themselves are reversing their position in some way. Maybe they're completely changing in a different character. They go from being a hero to a villain. Maybe they go from having very strict moral standards to no longer having moral standards. Or it might be that someone else reverses on them. Their mentor figure or their sidekick or their best friends ends up betraying them in some way. That could be a reversal. So suddenly everything that we've had for the whole beginning and middle of the story is now switched around. And what that does is it gives you enough story fuel to write the second half of the middle. Now, a third thing that you can do to juice the story is to employ Chandler's Law. This comes from Raymond Chandler, and he just said, if you get stuck in your story, just have a guy with a gun come into the scene. And I think the bigger picture idea here is you've been writing with certain characters, have an outsider come into the mix. Some sort of outsider which will stir up the pot, which will create new story opportunities for you to run with for the rest of your middle. Now, if you want more ways to juice your story, check out my video on 9 shocking strategies to keep your reader awake until 2 a.m. I detail a lot more in that video. I cover stuff like twists and surprises and a whole bunch of other stuff, so I'll put the link in the description so you can check that out when you're done with this one. Now, this next idea for what you can do for your middle is one that not a lot of writers think of. It's number 3, throw in a digression. A digression is basically a chunk of your novel that seems disconnected from the main plot line. But the reason you might want to throw it in is maybe it connects metaphorically with what the theme is in your book, or maybe it helps the protagonist learn something which gets them to the next stage of the journey. And the strategy here is, if you have been aiming directly at your plot, just hammering through those plot lines, and suddenly you get stuck, well, maybe take a step back and come at the plot from an oblique angle, from the side. And maybe that'll give you the step that you need to push forward with your plot. For an example of this, let's look at Haruki Murakami's The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. There is a section in this novel, I think about halfway through, where there's a whole chapter in which an old soldier tells the protagonist a long story. The story is set in World War II. He was a Japanese soldier and he is going into Manchuria. They end up getting captured by the Soviets and a guy ends up getting skinned alive, and then the witness gets thrown in a well. Now, readers might be wondering, okay, this isn't the protagonist. Why are we getting such a long story about this? It's definitely a digression. And I think the reason why is it's echoing what's happening in the other part of the novel. It's teaching us something about war, and that's something that Murakami wants to comment on thematically. And also, the guy that gets thrown in a well, the protagonist ends up going into a well in other parts of the story. So it's talking metaphorically about what the protagonist is experiencing. He's basically saying, don't let your mind get stuck in that well. Like, you have to break free of the well. Anyway, I would encourage you to explore a possible story within a story or some other form of digression in the middle of your book if that's the way forward for your protagonist. Maybe that's the only way they can move forward in the book. The next step to fixing your novel's middle, which honestly not enough writers think about, is number 4. Ditch your oversimplistic structures. Hey, if you've been following a lot of screenwriting advice, and maybe you think like, oh, I'm gonna figure out the 3-act structure for my story, I find that a lot of writers end up running out of steam because they have chosen a structure which is just a little bit oversimplistic. If you think about movie advice, I feel like that is a storyline which matches up better with short stories rather than with movies. And I think this is borne out by the evidence. There are so many short stories that end up being adapted in a film, from Minority Report to Brokeback Mountain. And that's because those two are equivalent. So I think when you're writing a novel, sometimes when screenwriting advice fails is because a novel is not equivalent to a film. It would be much better to compare a television series to a novel. That is an equivalent amount of storytelling space. So you need a more complex structure for your novel. Perhaps a 7-point story structure novel, which I have covered in some of my other videos. Or perhaps if you need a lot of advice, you go to something like Save the Cat, which has more beat by beat points of what you need at every single point of the story. That's advice that will get you through the middle of your novel. And I'll just make 2 comments about the more complex structure you need in the middle. One, you need to just not have setbacks, but an escalating series of setbacks. So you don't have 1 setback or 2 setback. It's more like a setback and then a little bit forward and then another setback and a little bit forward and another setback and a little bit forward. So an escalating series where every single one is getting a little bit more intense and more at stake. And the other thing I will say about the middle is make sure you know where you are going towards. If you don't know your ending, of course you're going to struggle in the middle because you're floundering. You're like, where's this story going? You're treading water. If you know the ending, if you know where you're going towards, then it'll be easier to write this middle section and you'll be able to come up with those story plot beats in an easier way. The 5th and final point about structure, before we transition into the 4 points about characters that will help the middle of your novel, is number 5, don't forget about subplot. Some of the time when writers are struggling with middles, it's because they're focused so much on their main plot and they don't have any other breathing room. They don't have any other parallel storylines that they can jump into for a moment that expands that section before they go back to the main plot. Yeah, if all you have is a main plot, then maybe like you're writing more of a novella length piece than a true novel. And you definitely need those subplots to expand what your novel space is doing. For an easy example of this, think about Breaking Bad. When you think about the main plot of Breaking Bad, it's Walter White transforming himself from this mild-mannered chemistry teacher into this savage drug meth kingpin. But the story would be a lot thinner if we didn't have multiple subplots off of Walter White's main story. Think about Jesse Pinkman's parallel storyline where he struggles with guilt and he struggles with addiction and he tries to find his own moral compass. Or also think about the whole antagonist subplot where you have Hank Schrader's pursuit of Walt, and we see him go step by step trying to locate who this meth kingpin is. So if you're struggling with content in the middle, try to find a good subplot or 2 subplots to run alongside your main plot. Okay, so let's transition into characters, because characters really can help us fix our middles. And for the first one, we're going to look at number 6. Make them face their main fear. In the beginning of your novel, it's good to set up a character who has very strong aversions to something, have a very strong fear to something, or maybe they just say, I will never do that. So once you've set that up, the middle of the novel is a perfect place to make them do the thing that they are deeply afraid of. Look at a story like Jaws. You have Chief Brody, who in the beginning of the storyline is deeply afraid of water. Well, that's just perfect fodder for writing the middle of the book, because obviously he's going to be pushed out to sea. He's going to have to make that choice to go to the ocean to try to hunt down Jaws. So his character contains the kernel of what the middle plot should be. Or think about the novel Room by Emma Donoghue. The characters are trapped inside a small room, a mother and her son, and the mother's greatest fear is that her son will be hurt or die. But she has to risk that in order to escape. She has to roll her son up in this carpet and, hope he doesn't suffocate, or hope the man who's imprisoning her doesn't kill her son. She has to risk that in order for them to try to escape. So if your character doesn't have a gigantic fear in the beginning of your novel, well, give them one. And that will help you with writing the middle of your novel as they have to confront that fear. This next point is the doozy, which will solve a lot of the problems in the middle of your novel. It is number 7. Deliberately sabotage your protagonist's strengths. So in the first half of your novel, your protagonist probably succeeded by using whatever intelligence or powers that they had to overcome the obstacles. That's great. That's classic storytelling right there. So the trick might be for the second half of your middle is to take that away from them. This forces them to adapt in all sorts of creative ways and gives you a lot of storytelling fodder to go in new directions. Look at a movie like Spider-Man 2. We have Peter Parker, who's doing fine and dandy as Spider-Man, but then all of a sudden he starts to lose his powers. So then he's forced to compensate for that. He's forced to figure out, like, what are these issues of self-doubt and stuff that is causing me to lose my powers? And he has to go through those obstacles and go on that journey to try to regain his powers. And for all of you who aren't writing superhero stories, which is a lot of you, I think this advice is just as applicable. If you have a character who is super analytical, then you try to force them into very emotional territory where they just feel out of their depth. If they are very physically powerful, then you might render them helpless through circumstance. Now, this advice obviously requires that you have established like what these character strengths are so you can sabotage them. So yes, it does require some character setup, but the reversal by taking away those strengths is going to be a great way to fuel the middle of your novel. This next point I think is probably the best one in this entire video. It is number 8. Have them question or change their desire. So obviously at the beginning of your novel, you set up some sort of strong character desire for your protagonist. That's awesome, that's great. A lot of people, they keep that same desire throughout the whole novel. And I think it's a better tip if halfway through that desire or goal gets changed or altered in some way. Look at The Godfather by Mario Puzo. You have Michael Corleone, who at the beginning, his desire is simply to have a very normal life with Kay. But then, halfway through the book, there is an attempted assassination on his father. And he steps into the ring, goes to a restaurant meeting, and ends up assassinating 2 men. So his entire desire changes from wanting to have a normal life to wanting to enlarge his father's mafia empire and slaughter those who oppose him. Another great example of this is in Minority Report with Tom Cruise. In the beginning, he is a very dutiful employee and he just wants to run the pre-crime unit and stop murders before they happen. But in the first half of the middle, his desire completely changes. He gets accused of a pre-crime, and so his desire is, oh, I just want to clear my name. But then in the second half of the middle, that desire expands into a much broader goal. He wants to dismantle the entire pre-crime unit because he feels like it's being abused. So listen, don't wait until the very end of your story to have character change. Make them change their desire, perhaps 2 or 3 times throughout the story, and that will help propel your story towards the end. Now it's time for the very last thing that you can do to help the middle of your novel out, and it is number 9, add backstory. So where backstory doesn't work very well is often in the beginning of a novel, because we don't yet have the present moment circumstances built up yet, and so you don't really have enough of a story to take time to go into backstory. However, by the middle of your novel, you've really set up the engine, the plot engine of your story really well, and now you have earned yourself the right to take a chapter and go into your character's backstory, if it's right for the type of book you're trying to write. And what you're looking for is you want backstory that explains a character decision in the present moment story, or backstory that just helps us to get to know this character so we understand what they are going to do next. I think of a novel like Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. The novel starts with the protagonist's present day story, and then we go into the backstory of the family history and all the incestuous relationships that led to the creation of this particular character and his or her problems, because he or she is Middlesex. Now, I will say to be careful with this one. Backstory is dangerous, especially if it goes on too long and we lose sight of the present moment story. And it's also dangerous because, not every book needs backstory. Sometimes it's fine to leave backstory as mysterious. You really need a reason why that backstory is essential for the middle of your novel. If it does not propel the story forward in some sort of way, you're better off leaving it out. I hope that helps you with the middle of your novel. Please watch another video of mine, like this one, subscribe to the channel, or check out some of the links I have in the description, which will help you along your writing journey.